In the last class that I shared about a week and a half ago, we looked at the thought of several Latin American thinkers who are considered kind of a sociological current called post-development. And they criticized a lot of what was occurring in Latin America and around what is known as the Third World. A lot of this kind of colonialist tendencies of development projects, trying to impose ideas of what it means to be developed onto other communities. And today I wanted to kind of continue that line of thought, but looking back at a group of thinkers who were most prevalent back in the 1960s, 70s, and up into the 80s. So we're going to look at the thought of three different thinkers. One is called E.F. Schumacher, whose most famous book was called Small is Beautiful. So that's where the title of the presentation comes from. We're also going to look at Leopold Kohr, who is another contemporary of E.F. Schumacher, and then Ivan Illich. These are three economists and sociologists, anthropologists that were very, very active thinking. And I think that the 1970s is an interesting period because it was kind of at the height of this. After the World War II ended, there was this huge economic boom, this kind of baby boomer generation that we refer to, where all of a sudden all of the wartime technologies really took off. And there was this enormous growth, and things were looking up. We were in the Cold War era, kind of the fight between communism and socialism and capitalism. But at the same time, all of the countries were discovering all of this growth that was made possible by technologies. There was the beginning of globalization. And there was this idea that everything that we are creating this kind of heaven on earth. But in the midst of that, there was a group of thinkers who urged us to kind of put our foot on the brake and started to look at some of the problems that this mindset of growth, of bigness, of globalization, of more technology, of extracting ever more of the of Earth's resources for human growth, for human population. Also critic oops, also criticizing, for example, all of the aspects of inequality between developed and underdeveloped nations. And so I think there in the 1970s was kind of this first reaction against this explosion of growth in the post-World War II era. And three of the thinkers that I think are most relevant are Leopold Kohr, E.F. Schumacher, and Ivan Illich. So I'm going to try and briefly introduce you all to the thought of these three thinkers. If you're interested in them, that I can recommend some great books that they wrote, all three of them. But I'm going to talk in the beginning a little about E.F. Schumacher, who he was, some of the basics of his thought. Then Leopold Kohr, who was actually a good friend with E.F. Schumacher. He talked a lot about what his term was the crisis of bigness. And then Ivan Illich, who was actually a Catholic priest who left the church and worked in several different areas in the United States, throughout different parts of Latin America and Mexico, and then ended up the end of his life teaching at different universities throughout Europe and the United States. And then I'm going to try and extract or synthesize some common ideas from these three thinkers, and see how we can how all three of them, though they didn't necessarily use this term, their critique of bigness was also a celebration of smallness, of localization. And I'm going to try and look at how the thought that they offered, their philosophies, can help us kind of try to rescue this idea of development uh, as a way to support local economies, to support small scale initiatives, to really bring back autonomy and agency to the communities where a lot of us who work in development industries, continue to work, instead of trying to force small scale communities, individuals to follow a homogenized model of what it means to be developed. Kohr, Schumacher, and Illich all kind of offer an idea that, look, there's different ways to express what a good life means. And all of that responds to this idea of localization, of local places developing strategies, techniques, technologies, ways of life, economies that respond to what is a good life for them, right? So that's kind of the outline of the class this morning. So E.F. Schumacher was a man from England. He was a British economist, trained as a classical economist at some of the best universities. And when at the beginning of his career, he was really not into any sort of alternative. He didn't question the dominant economic paradigms of his day. Actually, he worked for the British government for almost 20 years, developing the coal industry, trying to find ways to how to help the British economy explode in the post World War II era by transitioning to this massive use of fossil fuels. So when you look at that background, you're like, well, that's not exactly a thinker who has ecological sensibilities or who believes in small scale. But in 1955, he had kind of this life-changing experience where he traveled as a consultant, an economic consultant, to the small country of Burma. And for the first time in his life, he experienced, firsthand, these communities that were living small scale lives that were many of the lifestyles in the local economies were based off of subsistence instead of producing for global trade, for export. And one of the things is that he went to the communities of Burma and he didn't see poverty. He didn't see scarcity. He didn't see misery. He saw people who were responding to their needs in a very real way. And it was interesting. A man who for 20 years had been working about growing, one of the most powerful economies in the world, suddenly saw that there was a way to kind of contradict this about small scale. And a lot of people, especially from the global north, still today, when they travel, from these wealthy, affluent countries where you can go online and buy anything you want. You can walk into Walmart and you see this abundance of things that are available. And then they go to these small scale places where maybe the monetary economy is lagging behind, where people produce for themselves instead of purchasing for themselves. And our kind of westernized mindset automatically associates that with poverty, with scarcity, with misery. And the development paradigm says, well, in order to cure that, what we need is to bring people into the fold, right? Help them to find ways to make more money, to exploit the resources more efficiently, to enter into this globalized growth economy. But Schumacher looked at Burma and he said, "Wait, these people are living fairly decent lives." Um, Shortly after his Burma is a country in Asia that it's mostly Buddhist. And Schumacher, when he was looking at that, he was saying, well, there's something about the way that they live. And he came up with what he called Buddhist economics. It's not anything religious or anything like that, but he was saying that there's something about the culture of Burma, of these small scale place communities that were happy and found happiness and fulfillment in providing for themselves from what their landscapes, what their geographies, what their territories could provide. That was fundamentally different from this westernized idea of what it means to live a good life. And so he wrote a paper called Buddhist Economics, which is a fascinating read. It was written back in the 1960s. And he developed the principles. There's several different principles that he outlines in this paper, but I'd like to mention two. Uh, he said that, first of all, individuals need good work for proper human development. As a trained economist, he was trained to see labor as something that was needed to fuel the economic machine, right? People needed to labor in order to produce the commodities that could then be purchased by consumers. And he looked at that and he said, that is essentially dehumanizing. And as economist, he said, good work is about doing things that bring fulfillment. And so he saw the difference between, in the 1960s and 1970s, a small scale worker in a coal mine in England, or a woman who was working 10, 12 hours at these factories producing whatever commodity the global market needed. And he compared that idea of labor to the idea of good work, such as a Burmese peasant growing rice, or a small scale artisan making some sort of small scale industry providing some sort of manufacture for the local market. And he saw that good work wasn't necessarily that which created more monetary income, which created more productivity, which was more efficient, but that which allowed people to develop themselves in a holistic way that allowed for happiness to evolve. And I kind of looking ahead, when we think about development projects today, a lot of times we automatically make the assumption that poor people need more money. Uh, and in many cases of misery, where a single mother simply does not have enough money to feed her children, we can say that that's important, obviously. But more money does not necessarily translate into greater human development. And so what Schumacher was arguing is that in the case of scarcity, what we need is to try to focus on certain types of work that create greater levels of happiness and well-being. And that does not necessarily always equate with larger incomes, more affluence, more purchasing power, whatever we want to say. Another principle that he outlines in Buddhist economics is that production from local resources for local needs is the most rational way of economic life. And I think that's really interesting that he uses the word rational there, because, you know, from this growth paradigm, this idea of a globalized economy, industrial production, rationality is focused on increasing efficiency. So small scale farmers here in El Salvador, for example, when we take the economic principle of comparative advantage, the idea is that, for example, here in El Salvador, we can grow avocados and mangoes very well. And so because our climate permits that, we should completely turn over our entire agricultural system to growing maybe coffee, maybe avocados, maybe mango, and then we can export those to the United States, to Canada, to Europe, and we can import all the other things that we need. That's what's seen as a rational way of living. In Africa, there's a lot of movement today to try and open up Africa to all sorts of different types of mining. Africa has an enormous amount of mineral resources, especially related to all of these rare earth metals that are needed for smartphones and technologies and artificial intelligence. And so the rational economic paradigm of globalization, of industrialization, says that Africa needs to open up its economy for this massive exploitation of resources, which it can then export to the rest of the world and create income so that they can import their food, their water, all of the basic necessities of life. And Schumacher says that's what's happening, but that's not the most rational way. The most rational way is to try and produce what you need as closely as possible. Um, Here's another quote from Buddhist economics. It's a long one, but I think it's very interesting. So he says, to organize work in such a manner that it becomes meaningless, boring, stultifying, nerve-wracking for the worker would be little short of criminal. It would indicate a greater concern with goods than with people, an evil lack of compassion and a soul-destroying degree of attachment to the most primitive side of this worldly existence. Equally, to strive for leisure as an alternative to work would be considered a complete misunderstanding of one of the basic truths of human existence, namely, that work and leisure are complementary parts of the same living process and cannot be separated without destroying the joy of work and the bliss of leisure. From the Buddhist point of view, there are therefore two types of mechanization which must be clearly distinguished: one that enhances a man's skill and power, and one that turns the work of man over to a mechanical slave, leaving the human being in a position of having to serve the slave. And this goes back to kind of his idea about dignifying work, right? It's not, I mean, if we increase the incomes of the global poor by enslaving them in sweatshops, enslaving them in mines, they might be, a small scale worker might see their income increase, right? But that does not necessarily translate to a greater well-being, a greater happiness, right? And so he was also very Schumacher was also very prescient about the idea of technologies we're going to look at here in just a second. But he talked a lot about this idea of the development of technologies as a way of replacing the human beings. And he talked about what's going to happen is that the human being is, instead of using a technology for the betterment of ourselves, of our lives, we're going to become enslaved to that technology. And I think that was something very, maybe prophetic is a word we could use there, because this was at the beginning, we still hadn't seen the rise of the internet and the computer age and things like that. But I think we can start to see some of that, today, from what he was speaking back in the 1970s. His most well-known book, which I mentioned at the beginning, is called Small is Beautiful. It's a short book. It was published in 1973. And in the book, he argues that we cannot consider the problem of technological production solved if it requires that we recklessly erode our finite natural capital and deprive future generations of its benefits. So in many ways, Schumacher was kind of one of the beginning, one of the first thinkers to really kind of hit the nail on the head, saying that, look, we are creating a monster of technological innovation, industrial production, a growth based economy that simply does not make sense and cannot continue indefinitely in a world where there are very real limitations to growth, limitations that stem from, the fact that the earth only has so much fossil fuels, that the earth can only incorporate or deal with so much waste that we have. So Small is Beautiful is one of the first books that really kind of started to look at this issue of, we cannot continue this path that we're globalizing, that we're homogenizing, that everybody around the world wants to follow, and hope that our children and our grandchildren and our great grandchildren are going to inherit a biosphere from us that is livable, right? So if we care about future generations, then we need to criticize and think around this idea that bigger is always better. Um, Small is Beautiful is a wonderful short little book. It's filled with all of these great little quotes. I picked out four of my favorite just to share with you. But he says here, the first one is an attitude to life which seeks fulfillment in the single minded pursuit of wealth. In short, materialism does not fit into this world because it contains within itself no limiting principle, while the environment in which it is placed is strictly limited. And so he says, look, here maybe we can try and translate that into those of us who work in development. If the development industry is solely focused on trying to implement a Western mindset, a Western growth-based economy to all of the rest of the world, we're going to butt up against these very real limits. Every environment is limited, right? Every place, you can grow so much food on a plot of land intensively before you start to ruin the fertility of that land. You can extract so much lumber from a forest before eventually you ruin that forest. So if the only thing we care about is extracting more production from the land, extracting more lumber from the forest, then eventually we're gonna come up against those limiting principles, which are something that we cannot overcome. Another quote, he says, any intelligent fool can make things bigger, more complex, more violent. It takes a touch of genius and a lot of courage to move in the opposite direction. And Schumacher was like I said, when he moved to Burma and when he started to look at all of these other ways that small scale place-based communities around the world, despite their simplicity, found these ingenious ways to carve out healthy, wholesome livelihoods, within these limitations. And it was fascinating for him to see how people could live very, very well in areas around the world where there were very, very real limitations. Like Dr. Lambert was saying in the morning, even in harsh environments such as the desert, where not lots of things grow, where there's limited rainfall. There have always been civilizations that have lived very, very well, and they didn't depend on their food from Walmart or from a grocery store. No, they found ways to live abundant lives within the restraints of each place, right? Another quote is modern man, woman, modern human being does not experience himself as a part of nature, but even as an outside force destined to dominate and conquer it. He even talks of battle with nature, forgetting that if he won that battle, he would find himself on the losing side. And so this is kind of, again, the beginning of this ecological kind of framework or mindset that says, look, if we beat nature, if we beat it into submission, if we make it do everything that we want to do, we're essentially defeating our future, right? We have to find a way to live well within the parameters of what the world can provide, right? And so he was one of the first ones that was, again, putting a brake on this growth-based economy and arguing that the best way to stop that was to return to a certain placeness, or a certain sense of localization where we can discover ways to live this kind of elegant lifestyle of living well within our place. And lastly, here's my favorite quote from the book. It says, "A man who uses an imaginary map, thinking that it is a true one, is likely to be worse off than someone with no map at all." And so, as a trained economist, I think he was kind of taking a swipe, taking a swing at his economist friends there, because as a trained economist, the map of global economy is like, we need to increase growth, increase GDP, increase the efficiency of the industrial production machine, find ways to extract resources ever faster, increase influence, increase progress. And he said, if that's our map, then it'd be better off if we didn't have any, because we're following a wrong path. So that's a very, very quick and limited introduction to Leopold's work. A friend of his, a contemporary who was a little bit older, was Leopold Kohr. And Kohr and Schumacher had these wonderful debates and discussions that are recorded now, but very interesting kind of dialogue between very deep thinkers. But one of the things that really, I guess, defined Kohr's life was that he was born into a very, very small village in the mountains of Austria. And he grew up in this, kind of in this pre-World War II in the early 1900s in a small scale village that still kind of embodied kind of what maybe Schumacher found in Burma, what you still find in lots of Latin American and indigenous communities, probably I've never been to Africa, but lots of places in Africa. This small scale livelihood where people find ways to live well within their biosphere, within their territory. And that influenced Kohr's thinking, because throughout his life he traveled widely. He taught at Harvard University and throughout Europe, but his thinking was always influenced by the ideal to which we should always strive is this idea of a small scale village economy where people live well, where people know one another, where people care for one another, where people are able to extract a decent living, a simple lifestyle, but a decent lifestyle from what that offers. And so he said, yeah, we need to cultivate this small scale holistic nature of village life that was being extinguished by the cult of bigness. His most famous work, his Obra Magna, was called The Breakdown of Nations. And throughout that book, he talks about the cult of bigness, right? That this idea that bigger is better. And one of the things that was interesting about Kohr was that he lived in Austria, which during World War II was obviously occupied by Nazi Germany, and he had to leave. But he had this whole kind of experience of the development of this huge, powerful nation state, whether it be Nazi Germany trying to colonize all of Europe, or then the United States and the Allied Western powers. So he saw this kind of political ideal of bigness, of the strong state, of growing kind of imperial global powers, and then after World War II, the growth of kind of the Cold War dichotomy between the Soviet Union and the United States. And he said, look, this idea of political bigness is causing all sorts of problems. It caused, fascism, the rise of fascism, the genocides that happen around the world, the nuclear powers that can wipe us out, all of these ecological, and I mean, he didn't live during the age of climate change, but I think we could probably say climate change, biodiversity loss, all of these ecological disasters that are happening to us. He said, are a crisis of bigness. It's the problem of how large we have grown as a community of people, as nation states, as economies. Here's another two quotes from his most famous book, which is called The Breakdown of Nations. He says, there seems to be only one cause behind all forms of social misery: bigness. Oversimplified as this may seem, we shall find the idea more easily acceptable if we consider that bigness, or oversize, is really much more than just a social problem. It appears to be the one and only problem permeating all creation. And he expands on this, saying, whenever something is wrong, something is too big. And if the body of a people becomes diseased with the fever of aggression, brutality, collectivism, or massive idiocy, it is not because it has fallen victim to bad leadership or mental derangement. It is because human beings, so charming as individuals or in small groups, communities, have been welded into over-concentrated social units. So throughout this discussion of what is this crisis of bigness, Kohr complete, says that, when we develop communities of right scale, when we come to this idea that we had that there is a right scale for our livelihoods, we generally do well, right? Human beings in families and small communities tend to get along pretty well. If we have differences, we can discuss those, we can debate those issues. It's the problem when we get too big, when we have, we grow into these massive conglomerations of nation states, and one of us wants to follow socialism, one of us wants to follow capitalism, and we fight. And during the Cold War, we developed these massive nuclear arm heads that could destroy the world. The problem, he says, is bigness. And kind of following from this idea, Corin Schumacher saw that this crisis of bigness was also a cult of bigness. Everybody wanted to follow this path. After World War II, all of Europe got onto this, and instead of developing these small scale villages in Austria, kind of these autonomous regions in France and Spain and Italy, everybody got on this idea that we need to create this massive nation state, follow this model put forth by the United States. And so they feared that this crisis of bigness would lead to the imposition of a single model of human development that was inevitably a failed model, right? This idea of following a map that was not correct. And I think they were right. If we look today, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, there's basically one model of human development that's put forth. It's this idea of opening markets to the global economy, of industrializing nations, of accepting all of the technological improvements that are thrown at us, of simply trying to grow, become more affluent, follow this path that's kind of been laid forward before us, right? This is a great quote from Schumacher. He says, "We may race up and down the entire North American continent and see nothing but Main Street all over again, filled with the same kind of people, following the same kind of business, reading the same kind of funnies and columnists, sharing the same movie stars, the same thoughts, the same laws, the same morals, the same convictions." And I haven't traveled a lot, but pretty much as soon as you fly into any airport in any part of the world, you'll see the same businesses. You'll see McDonald's. You'll see similar magazines. You'll see similar expressions of cultural thought, and this kind of imposition of a homogenous model of what it means to live well. I think is dangerous. In all parts of the world, diversity is what is generally associated with health, right? If we lose diversity in our body, for example, through the rapid succession of cancer cells, we die, right? The cancer cell doesn't want diversity; it wants uniformity of itself. In an ecosystem, when one species starts to grow and starts to kill off the rest of those species, it eventually kills itself by killing off everything that it depends on. Diversity is better, and the same goes for the expression of what it means to live healthy lives. And Corin Schumacher especially saw that this crisis of bigness, which canceled out the beauty and the uniqueness of smallness, was a threat to human well-being. And lastly, a last kind of thought of Schumacher, which I mentioned earlier, is that he talked a lot about how technology plays a role in this homogenization of bigness, right? He was a pioneer of what is now called the appropriate technology movement. He wasn't anti-technology. He wasn't, saying we should all go back to the Stone Age, but he said we need to create technologies that are user-friendly and ecologically suitable to the scale of the community, right? So he said the community needs to have a certain level of autonomy and agency to determine what technologies they should accept and what technologies they shouldn't. He believed that unfettered technological development would lead inevitably to an idolatry of gigantism. Again, this idea of bigness, of improper scale of human development, where the technological ends would create more problems than they created. And he talked a lot throughout several of his books and lectures about the idea of mobility, the technology of mobility. So the idea is everybody wants a car. The car, your own personal automobile, in theory, creates more mobility. You can go farther, you can go faster, you can move more. But he says if you go into any big city around the world today, this idea of technological development through everybody owning their personal vehicle has led to misery. Here in Central America, in San Salvador, the city, the biggest city in the country where I live, there was a recent report that said the average person spends about between 4 and 6 hours every day in traffic. commuting to their place of work, returning to their home. And Schumacher would say, that's the opposite of freedom. You don't have more mobility. You're wasting your life in traffic. And so he said we need to think about really what are the benefits and drawbacks of technology and how we can create appropriate technologies that really liberate human beings in their places instead of kind of shackling us to this idea. One more thinker. I'm going to try and finish up so we can have some time for chat. But one more thinker that I think is extremely important, and I would invite you all to look into his thought, is Ivan Illich. He was another man from Austria, but kind of traveled around the world. He spent a lot of time in Mexico. He was a contemporary thinker of Kohr and Schumacher, and they kind of independently. Illich knew of Schumacher, but they weren't good friends or anything. But it's interesting that all three of these thinkers kind of independently started creating this same kind of critique of bigness, of industrialism, of globalization, of unfettered technology. And Illich wrote a book called Convivial Tools. He used the word tools instead of technology, but he was very, very critical as well of technological development. And he criticized the monopoly of industrial tools and advocated for what he called tools for conviviality. And those were a convivial tool or a convivial technology was that which gave each person who uses them the greatest opportunity to enrich the particular and contextual environment with the fruits of his or her vision. Industrial tools deny this possibility to those who use them, and they allow their designers to determine the meaning and expectations of others. So Illich was saying that this kind of development paradigm which imposes technologies on the rest of the world, right? So, for example, let's take the smartphone. In the last decade, technology, pretty much every person in every country has a smartphone, and that's not something that we can necessarily determine how we can use that. Right? It's something that kind of is imposed on us, saying this is what you have to use. You have to use this tool in order to access your banking, to talk with people. And it's kind of this idea where it's not individuals, it's not small scale communities who are really autonomously deciding the meaning of their lives and how to use this tool. And Illich was very, very critical of this, right? He's saying that we need to kind of establish this idea that human beings should have autonomy over their technologies, right? He also talked a lot about the war on the vernacular, vernacular is a word kind of relating to like traditional ways of doing things. We talk about traditional architecture, traditional homes, traditional vernacular forms of speech, as opposed, the slang terms of each of the different ways of speaking, vernacular forms of agricultural production. But he was saying that in modern times, the state and then the globalized capitalist enterprise, globalization, industrialization is essentially a war against subsistence or vernacular ways of living. This idea of globalization is saying that there is only one way to do things, right? And it's this path of progress, of development, of growth, and that is essentially a war against the vernacular expressions about how people in every part of the world throughout history have tried to create their own autonomous expressions of how to live well in place. And he said one of the fascinating things about his thought, he said that by commodifying everything, by making everything something that we have to purchase, that we have to find from others, and enclosing the commons, this creates a false sense of scarcity. People are led to believe they can no longer provide for themselves, but must depend on the state, large corporations, professionals. I think we could add development organizations, this whole idea of dependency, in order to provide the essentials, right? So this idea of schooling, he talked a lot about schooling. He said the idea of a mandatory public education school is to make people believe that learning is a scarcity, right? He said, no, throughout people have always learned. There's always been this process of learning. Even in pre-literate societies, young people were taught what they needed to know in order to survive. We have always had the ability to learn. But when we institute this idea of a school, which has a monopoly on knowledge, then it becomes scarcity, and you have to find ways to send your child to the best schools, to invest in his or her education in order to obtain this thing which we used to create for ourselves. And he said that, the same idea of the scarcity of knowledge we can find in food production and transportation, etc. And here's a quote from one of his famous books called Tools for Conviviality. He says, the general framework implied here is that every attempt to substitute a universal commodity provided by the state, by a corporation, by professionals, whatever it might be, for a vernacular activity has led not to equality, but to a hierarchical modernization of poverty. Step by step, the war against subsistence has defined as commodities what was essential for living communities, and in each case has resulted in new hierarchies and new forms of domination. So I think that's interesting. He said, you know, we define poverty today by those who are able to obtain this Western ideal that we could encapsulate in this idea of the American dream. If you obtain the American dream, you're not living in poverty. If you don't, you are living in poverty. But this ability to define what is what defines a good life is hierarchical. It's a form of colonization. It's a form of mental colonization. And Illich throughout his work said, look, we need to rescue this idea of vernacular expressions of how to live well in place. Something that was very, very, in tune with Schumacher's idea of small is beautiful, and Core's idea that the crisis we have is this crisis of the homogenization of bigness. Okay, so let's to end with, I have about 5 minutes left. Let's look at how the thought of Illich and Schumacher and Core, can kind of inform the work that many of us do in the work of development. If you work in a community development organization or some similar organization, how can these critiques offered by these three thinkers help us kind of reevaluate the work that we do? And so one is the path towards localization. Illich, Schumacher, and Core all believed that small-scale localized communities organized to provide for their own needs was the best way to create dignified lifestyles wherein the human being could exert a certain degree of autonomy and agency over their own lives. Another thing that localization, another advantage or benefit of localization is that it provides access to negative feedback. What do we mean by that? Well, localized livelihoods also force individuals and communities to be held directly responsible for the consequences of their economic, social, and political lives, right? The bigger that we get, the larger scale of humanity, it's easier and easier to kind of not think about the consequences of our actions, right? Every time we purchase something online, or if we go to a huge department store or Walmart or whatever it might be, none of us has any clue about where that thing was made, under what conditions the person who made it did, what were the ecological consequences of that, what were the social consequences of that. We're relieved of this kind of ethical duty to think about the consequences of our actions due to the largeness and the bigness of the global kind of economy that we live in today. In ecological terms, this meant that we can no longer when we live in localized communities, we can't externalize the negative aspects of how we live, but we must directly deal with them. And so, example, I mean, one of the problems with this globalized economy today is that none of us takes any sort of responsibility for our individual reactions, our individual actions. And the consequence of that is global climate change, biodiversity loss, accumulation of toxic chemicals. And all of us can say, well, I'm not responsible for that. I only purchased one thing, but the accumulation of this kind of liberation from responsibility has caused all of these ecological crises that we face. And one of the examples that I really like to show to students that we work with, sometimes we have study abroad groups come down here to Latin America, is when a young student from Canada or the United States comes to Latin America, or perhaps to Africa as well, one of the first things they see is that there's trash all over the road. We have plastic bags. People tend to throw things away. They throw it out of the bus window. And and people who are from the global north, where there are, fairly good waste management systems where you don't see trash on the roadside as much. And people criticize this. Oh, people in Latin America are so dirty. Why don't they take care of their trash? And so we always say, well, let's think about this. And we look at statistics, for example, at how much trash an average person in the United States creates compared to the amount of trash that a small relatively poor person in Latin America creates. And there's an enormous difference. Obviously, people in the United States create much more waste. The problem is that that waste is hidden, right? So they take it. A lot of the recyclables, when people recycle their waste in the United States, essentially what they do is they export that waste to China, to other Asian countries. A lot of that waste is buried in these massive landfills. In many states in the United States, the highest mountain isn't a natural mountain. It's a landfill waste, right? So you look at and so you look at this is that it's harder for people in the United States to really deal with how can we reduce our waste footprint because it's hidden from us, right? We put it outside on the curb and the trash is taken away and we don't have to think about that. Whereas here in Latin America, we see it, we feel it. People don't like living amongst trash here in the small community where I live. If somebody is throwing waste into the little creek that runs along the border of my farm, I'm going to go and confront them because I use that water to drink from to water my crops. So the more visible a problem is, the better we can react to that. We experience the negative feedback personally, communally, and so by living localized lives, it allows us to deal directly with the problems of how we live. Um, two more things real quick. The connection to development, this whole idea of localization. Ivan Illich, in the introduction to his most famous book, Tools for Conviviality, says, with this book, above all, I want to show that 2/3 of humankind still can avoid passing through the industrial age by choosing right now a post-industrial balance in their mode of production, which the hyper-industrial nations will be forced to adopt as an alternative to chaos. This was written back in 1970. I think that 2/3 of humankind maybe we've gone beyond that. Maybe it's half now. But he essentially believed that this industrial model of growth is going to come to an end. And so those of us who work in development work, if we believe that this model has failed, well, we need to try and find ways where we can help the communities where we work, we can help our own lives, find ways to go around to try and create this post-industrial balance, right? A way of responding to create more healthier livelihoods in the world where we live. So if the global problems we face stem from a crisis of bigness, if the unencumbered progress of technology is forcing us ever deeper into the holes that we are digging for ourselves, if the growing scale, the quickening pace, and the confusing patterns of modernity are causing people and communities to lose autonomy and agency over their own lives, then perhaps we need to think outside the box of the development discourse. How can we think outside that? And I want to leave you all with 3 questions that maybe we can discuss a little bit more in the few moments we have left. What might an appropriate technology look like in a world dominated by smartphones and artificial intelligence? Number 2, how can development programs and projects seek to rescue or support the vernacular values of subsistence and belonging? And lastly, if small is truly beautiful, how might we work towards a world of right responsibility, proper scale, and a human scale pace and pattern of life? I don't have the answers to that, but I think those are important questions. So I'm going to go ahead and close my screen here, and I would ask Dr. Lambert to help facilitate this last 15 minutes or so that we have to discuss.